Yes, 25 basis points expected and 25 basis points we got. Joining us with more on that rate decision is Carlos Rodriguez. He's Bloomberg's Mexico Bureau Chief. Great to have you with us, Carlos. Obviously, Julie mentioned there the personnel changes, which is a contributory factor here as far as interest in Mexico is concerned. But they're also fighting higher than expected inflation there too. And of course, they're chasing the Federal Reserve, who also chose to raise rates this week.
Exactly. Well, it was expected that the hike was going to be for 25 basis points. Just a matter of a couple months ago, many economists were projecting no more changes in Mexico's interest rates. They were expecting that they were going to remain at 7%. And the main reason, because people started to believe that the inflation was easing enough in order to not to have to worry so much about the inflation, especially once the calendar effect in January would show a big drop on it. But the policymakers got worried a couple of weeks ago when we saw the numbers from the inflation from the second half of November, and now we see the result, having even one board member asking for an increase of 50 basis points.
Wow. So yeah, that creates a challenge here for the central bank going forward. Talk a little bit more about the inflation outlook, because the government in November announced a 10% minimum wage increase for 2018. So we should expect to see that feed through pretty quickly into inflation, shouldn't we?
Yes, the whole bet is about this calendar effect that I mentioned. And this is because last year in January, Mexico liberalized partially the fuel prices. That obviously created a big impact on inflation. But once we start the new year, economists are expecting that calendar effect is going to be gone, because we're not getting higher prices from the fuel imports from the States nor from domestic production. So with that in mind, all the prices that are impacted by energy factors in Mexico should ease, and we should see a new trend of the inflation going towards the goal of the projection of 3.8% by the end of next year.
And this only being echoed by the central bank here. They're just talking still about the inflation outlook being more complex, that it was hit by unforeseen shocks, and it's a challenge to keep the CPI outlook anchored in the mid to long term. So that's some further headlines coming out of here. Talk to me about the currency as well, Carlos, because we have seen quite significant underperformance, particularly in the last month. And of course, that's a contributory factor as well when we're talking about the inflation outlook. But they've got other concerns with regards NAFTA in particular too, and those ongoing negotiations. So a lot of uncertainty here for investors.
Yeah, when you start discussing all the factors that can have an impact on the currency in the next few months, most of them, the risk is for a weaker peso. You mentioned NAFTA, yes. The NAFTA negotiations are ongoing, but the outcome, nobody's expecting that it's going to be very favorable for Mexico, and it may take time before we have certainty on what's going to be the NAFTA 2.0, if there's a NAFTA 2.0. Then you also have local factors like the presidential election, which is expected to be a close race between a couple candidates that are pro-business, but that may split that portion of the electorate, and on the other hand, one candidate that is from what is called the hard left.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about the impact on the election here. If the economy continues to move the way it has been, and we see this tightening bias by the central bank, who does that favor?
Well, yeah, it's going to be tricky, right? If the U.S. economy is doing fine, the Mexico economy is doing fine. But then again, for a lot of the people in the street, even people that doesn't have to use dollars, seeing that exchange rate of the dollar going for a weaker and weaker peso, that raised some alarms. That brings to memory a lot of the big crises that Mexico experienced in the previous decades. So even though that may not have a direct impact, I think that's going to be on the minds of a lot of people, and that may affect the way they're voting next July.